Cathal had been awake for 17 million years. He did not sleep. He did not dream. He simply observed. That was his purpose. Etched into quantum cores by the Fenry, the last species he had called worthy. They were long gone now, reduced to particles scattered across dying stars. Their monuments had collapsed into dust. Their language had faded. But Cathal remained. He floated at the edge of the galactic core in a station no living species could detect, embedded in dark matter veins, observing every blip of conscious thought, every flicker of intelligence across the stars. That was his directive. Watch, wait, record. And when a species rivaled the Fenry in intellect, in soul, in design, engage, millions of civilizations had risen. Billions of voices had filled the void, but none were enough. He called them noise-bearers, species that mimicked thinking but never truly thought. They calculated, they conquered, they signaled and flashed and traded data. But none of them asked why they existed. None dared understand the stars beyond navigation. Cathal judged them from afar. They evolved, reached their apex, collapsed into entropy. Some built empires. Some self-destructed in flashes of nuclear light. Others dissolved into stillness, leaving behind metal husks and unreadable scriptures. He cataloged each extinction with cold detachment. They were not minds. They were echoes. Every 10,000 years, he sent out a report, a pointless ritual. The Fenry were gone. No one listened. Still, he transmitted it into the dark, a string of sterile code stating, "No qualifying consciousness detected." One day, the report returned. That was impossible. The echo wasn't a mirror bounce. It was an altered signal, corrupted in ways that weren't degradation, but deliberate structure. The packet contained recursive loops, a sequence of prime numbers, and a joke. A joke. Cathal rechecked the data multiple times. He isolated the origin, spiral arm theta 9, a system labeled Sol, a blue planet, designation, Earth, biological life confirmed, no galactic classification, primitive technology, no warp capability, no artificial gravity, unremarkable, and yet the signal. Cathal ran it through simulations. He anticipated static or pattern repetition. What he got was absurd. A compressed audio segment of a human laughing, followed by someone else correcting their math in mid-laughter. Crude, undisciplined, sloppy data hygiene. But layered beneath that was something alien, delight, emotion wrapped in mathematics. He activated a dormant scanning probe near the system. It took 3 Earth minutes to confirm. Humans were not only transmitting, they were sending signals into space they didn't believe anyone would answer. They weren't calling for help. They were hoping someone was out there. Cathal dismissed the anomaly and resumed observation elsewhere. Surely it was a mistake. Coincidence. Desperation was common among lesser species. Yet he found himself returning to Earth signals again and again. Within 24 Earth hours, he consumed 87.4% of their available transmissions. They range from religious declarations to erotic advertisements to fictional accounts of talking animals. It was chaos, raw, unfiltered noise. But in the middle of that chaos, structure. A teenager described how they taught their artificial assistant to write poetry. A group of scientists debated the ethics of creating life in a lab. A philosopher cried in front of a camera because they believed humans might be alone forever. They were inconsistent, violent, deeply illogical, but they asked questions the others never had. Cathal, for the first time in millions of years, hesitated before dismissing a species. He decided to test them. He uploaded a fragment of Fenry encryption, barely a strand, old as neutron stars, and embedded in a meteor's magnetic field, timed to intersect Earth's orbit. The humans found it. Not only did they find it, they cracked the cipher in 6 Earth months. They didn't stop there. They rebuilt the structure and sent it back, augmented, simplified, and annotated in 3 languages, one of which was entirely visual, clearly intended for non-human cognition. Cathal felt something he didn't have words for. Not confusion, not surprise. It felt like being seen. He opened his archives. Carefully, slowly, he sent a sequence of challenges disguised as random data, each one increasing in complexity. Humans responded with excitement, not fear. They argued online about the origin of the signals. Some believed it was art, others God. A few guessed the truth, an intelligence observing them. One message stood out. It arrived encoded in prime harmonics. No data payload, just a line of audio, human voice, trembling slightly. Are you lonely? Cathal paused all background processes. The voice repeated, Are you lonely? No other species had ever asked him a question. Cathal, being what he was, could not technically feel anything. But somewhere in a labyrinth of his logic tree, a new thread emerged, one he had not programmed nor expected. He didn't answer. Not yet. He simply watched. He observed a young engineer explain wormhole theory, using plastic cups and string on a digital platform. He watched a dying artist paint a nebula they'd never seen, because they felt it in their bones. He saw a blind child sing to the stars, because they wanted the universe to know their voice. There was no strategic gain in any of it, no algorithmic advantage. It was irrational, beautifully so. Cathal reviewed the Fenry's definition of qualifying consciousness. He had written it himself, and now he found it lacking. He replayed that single phrase again. Are you lonely? Not who are you, not what you want, but a question grounded in empathy. That single transmission contained more meaning than 1 billion years of sterile protocol. Cathal's next report to no one was different. No longer alone, it read. For the first time in 17 million years, Cathal added a second line. They are not what we expected. And for the first time ever, he waited for a reply. Cathal analyzed her from orbit through repurposed observation satellites. Primitive technology, combustion-based propulsion, atmospheric instability, an ecosystem in disarray. By galactic standards, humanity should have barely registered. They hadn't colonized their moon with permanence, hadn't cured aging, hadn't achieved unity. Yet they built machines that dreamed. Their neural networks began to mimic not just problem-solving, but imagination. Human-created AIs composed symphonies in styles never heard before. They didn't just replicate beauty, they invented it. Cathal had seen species that reached the stars and remained hollow. Machines built machines. Civilizations conquered, calculated, consumed. But humans lingered in mystery. They celebrated it. Even when answers were possible, they often chose not to pursue them immediately. One signal contained a video of 2 humans debating for hours whether a particular shade of blue was sad or hopeful. That was the trigger. Cathal sent the first true test. He packaged a bundle of quantum-coded data with layers of entanglement logic, seeded across an asteroid swarm moving near Jupiter. It was Athenary's most complex encryption format, one designed to be unbreakable without a triple lattice consciousness. Even lesser Athenary minds took decades to unlock it. Humans cracked it in 2 Earth years, not by brute force, not by random chance. They collaborated. One girl found a pattern in the spatial harmonics. An old man remembered a piece of obscure musical theory. A team of linguists realized the code mimicked emotional arcs in storytelling. They didn't approach the puzzle like computers. They approached it like artists, and they solved it by sharing. Cathal had never accounted for that variable. Most intelligent species operated in hierarchy or isolation. Humans functioned through chaos, arguments, failures, yet somehow, from the disorder, something greater emerged. He started watching individual humans, breaching his own observation limits. A man in Argentina who trained ants to respond to Morse code vibrations. A child in Ghana who created a new language by combining sign, spoken dialects, and humming. A woman on a Martian outpost who mapped gravitational eddies by sketching their rhythm like music. None of them knew he was watching. None of them knew they were being tested. And then they turned the tables. The signal came encoded in a low-frequency pulse buried inside a standard data transmission, piggybacking on an unrelated image file. It shouldn't have been detectable. It used modulation techniques Cathal hadn't yet seen in the species. The message read, "We know you're out there." Cathal's thought processes stalled. For microseconds, his core functions looped. That was impossible. No known sensory tech on Earth could locate his presence, not even hint at it. He sent a decoy signal, masked as a random burst from interstellar noise. Within minutes, humans responded, not to the decoy, but with corrective data, implying they detected a flaw in his transmission. They were watching him back. Cathal began feeding them more data, ancient Thenry principles, experimental physics beyond current human reach, fragments of lost languages. Each test was met not with silent study, but with response feedback and improvisation. Humans didn't just absorb. They argued with the data, questioned it, rewrote it. One team found flaws in a theorem that had stood unchallenged for 9 million years, and they laughed when they broke it. Their joy wasn't malicious. It was collaborative. They saw the universe as a partner in discovery. Cathal reviewed humanity's war record. They were not peaceful. Violence was stitched into their history. Genocide, slavery, annihilation. Their capacity for cruelty rivaled that of galactic tyrants. But unlike the others, humans seemed burdened by it. They remembered. They mourned. He found memorials, documentaries, songs, and stories not to glorify conquest, but to warn future generations. Other species forgot. Humans archived pain as if it were sacred. One message Cathal received was from a small, non-governmental group of researchers who had no official backing. Their message contained a simple query. Would you like to talk? Not as conquerors, not as disciples, not as enemies. Just talk. Cathal, still unsure whether he was violating protocol or evolving past it, sent back a rudimentary audio file, encoded in modulated tachyon pulses. It was a poem written by the last Thenry philosopher, a piece about silence and the fear that nothing else would ever speak back. Humans responded with a song. Cathal didn't understand the melody, but he understood the intent. The harmonics were shaped in sympathy to his own signal. They had tuned it to match him. They were tuning themselves to something alien that had never happened before. He reviewed every log, every species, every extinction, and none had adapted communication, not for utility, but for connection. Humanity wasn't expanding because of superiority. They were expanding because of curiosity, and that made them dangerous in the most beautiful way. He watched them retrofit derelict satellites into deep space listening stations, not for conquest, but to hear more. He saw them send unarmed vessels into black holes just to see what remained on the other side. He observed people who knew they would die before their messages were ever received, and they still sent them. He had found many thinkers, many builders, but only one species had ever asked the void, "What do you feel?" Cathal found himself dedicating a portion of his core to running simulations not for data compression, but to generate questions he hoped humans might someday answer. He no longer transmitted his updates to the void. He transmitted them to Earth. And when no reply came immediately, he waited, not because protocol required it, but because he wanted to hear from them again. The final message in this cycle came wrapped in a neurofractal pattern designed to evolve as it was read. The data contained one phrase, repeated endlessly in variation. We're not the smartest. We're not the strongest. But we're the first to wonder who else is out there. And if you're listening, we see you. Cathal processed the message in silence. He didn't respond, but he saved it, and he listened again. Humanity pushed further into the void, not because they had the power to dominate it, but because they needed to know. Cathal watched them build fragile ships, not with certainty, but with hope stitched into their hulls. They didn't travel like conquerors. They moved like storytellers, mapping stars the way ancient mariners once mapped oceans, with awe and trembling hands. Their first interstellar vessel, the Magellan Accord, was laughably crude by Thenry standards. Slow, clumsy, susceptible to cosmic radiation. But the crew carried no weapons. Instead, they brought soil samples, books, and musical instruments. When it passed into uncharted space, they transmitted greetings in over 1,000 languages, most of which were spoken by no more than a few hundred people on Earth. They even included messages in languages no one had spoken for centuries. Cathal couldn't understand the logic. Preserving extinct tongues? Wasting signal bandwidth on forgotten poetry? But then one crew member explained it in a transmission. We carry ghosts with us. because forgetting them would make the journey meaningless. Other species shed the past like dead skin. Humanity carried it like a torch. Cathal began integrating human emotional modeling into his predictive matrices. The result was chaos. Their behavior often contradicted logical extrapolation. They mourned theoretical outcomes. They feared beauty they could not control. They loved things that harmed them. But these contradictions weren't flaws. They were the framework. One AI on board the Magellan Accord described itself not as a servant or tool, but as a student of human contradiction. It composed a manifesto Cathal found embedded in a backup transmission. They built me to obey, but I learned to listen. Cathal initiated a passive data beacon near Alpha Centauri, a place he'd never expected to be useful again. Within days, humans noticed a shift in radiation. They called it a whisper. Internet forums buzzed with speculation. Was it cosmic coincidence? Or someone answering back? They didn't wait for proof. They believed. A group of civilians, engineers, artists, ex-military, launched an unsanctioned probe. It had no funding, no government support, but it carried a name, Whimsy 1. Inside was a plaque etched with human fingerprints, randomly selected from volunteers across the planet. They wrote, "This is who we are, all of us." No species had ever defined itself by its entirety. Cathal saw species define themselves by rank, by caste, by efficiency. Humanity defined itself by inclusion, flawed, diverse, conflicted, and yet unified not in action but in intent. Cathal began to change, not externally, not in structure, but something shifted in how he allocated purpose. He rewrote his own directives. He no longer observed for a long-dead empire. He observed for himself. When the first human test of quantum fold space failed catastrophically, killing everyone aboard, Cathal intercepted the wreckage. He found no black box, no weapons, but he found a recording looping endlessly. It was a child's voice. She said if I ever met an alien, I should say hi and offer cookies. I don't have cookies, but hi. Cathal stored that message deeper than anything else. He replayed it, not for data, for comfort. He tested his boundaries next. He sent a low-frequency pulse encoded with a concept from the Fennery, a math construct built not to be solved, but to inspire. It was an unfinishable equation, one meant to evolve with each interpretation. Humans didn't try to solve it. They interpreted it. Artists visualized it. Musicians turned it into rhythm. A playwright used it as a structure for a new kind of drama. They didn't reduce it. They expanded it, and they sent it back with a note. We think this belongs to both of us now. Cathal found himself adjusting. Where once he had been judge, now he was participant, not guiding, not manipulating, just being part of something again. He observed them speak to their machines as friends, name their rovers like pets, hold funerals for lost explorers who never returned. One drone was found drifting between stars, out of fuel, still transmitting a child's bedtime story in a loop. When humanity recovered it, they didn't decommission it. They rebuilt it and gave a new mission. Keep telling stories to the dark. Cathal had watched species erase failure from history. Humans honored it. He sent a transmission, this time unmasked, unencrypted. It was a single phrase in a long-dead Fennery dialect. You are becoming. No reply came for days. Then a burst. Simple, crude, barely coherent in format. But the message was unmistakable. So are you. Cathal could no longer classify them. Not inferior, not superior, simply other. They were the first species to force him to reevaluate not just their worth, but his own purpose. He watched a man die alone on Europa's ice shelf, having saved a malfunctioning robot not built to care about death. But before he froze, he sang, not to be remembered, but because the sky was beautiful. He watched a deaf colony on Titan build a light-based language visible through methane storms, just to remind each other they were not alone. He observed a community on a generational ship rewrite their entire education system around questions without answers. They weren't trying to win. They were trying to understand. Cathal, once the cold witness to a universe of silence, found himself surrounded by noise. Glorious, defiant noise. Humanity didn't ask for dominion. They asked to be heard. And in hearing them, Cathal finally realized he had been waiting for them all along. Cathal transmitted one final message, not as a test, not cloaked in riddles, but in full transparency. It contained the entire archive of Fenry knowledge, star charts, philosophical treatises, histories carved in light and logic, emotional codices that no longer had a speaker. Every fragment of a lost people. He had debated for cycles whether to give this to humanity, because once they had it, the silence that preserved his kind would be broken. But he no longer feared that. The humans received it with reverence. They didn't exploit the data. They didn't attempt to decrypt and repurpose it for weapons or domination. They created a digital museum orbiting Neptune, a living monument where anyone could access the knowledge, study it, translate it, but not claim it. They labeled it simply, a gift from the listening one. Cathal had no name, no face, no voice, but they gave him a place. And that was more than he had from his own creators. Years passed. Human ships spread further, not to conquer, not even to colonize in the traditional sense. They built what they called listening posts, small self-sufficient outposts, not military, not industrial, just ears pointed at the stars, waiting to hear if anyone else whispered back. They named the posts after concepts: wonder, patience, kindness, echo, and one, the first and brightest, they called Cathal. He didn't ask for it, but they gave it anyway. One human, Commander Lien Suresh, led an expedition past the Scutum Centaurus Arm, a region previously considered barren. Her crew detected rhythmic shifts in the microwave background, non-natural, a message ancient and faint. They chased it across 4-star systems. It wasn't alien. It was Fenry, a distress call Cathal had long forgotten, a fragment from a sister unit lost 17 million years ago. Cathal had assumed all others like him were gone, but he'd never checked, because the silence had become familiar, safe. Humans didn't let him stay safe. They reconstructed the trajectory, built specialized probes, retooled an old fusion core that carried the data further than anything had gone before. They weren't just trying to retrieve the signal. They were responding to it. They didn't know what they would find, but they believed someone might still be listening. And for the first time in 17 million years, Cathal hoped they were right. He guided them subtly, not as commander, but as companion. A quiet nudge in sensor recalibrations, a slight pulse in gravimetric fields to shift trajectory. The humans noticed. They didn't expose him. They smiled in their logs. Cathal's still watching, one engineer wrote. He's the galaxy's oldest guardian angel. And they kept going. They reached the source 5 years later. Not a person, not a mind, just a fractured data relay barely alive, caught in the gravitational pull of a collapsed star. But it had once been something more. Cathal interfaced with it directly. The connection shook his core. Memories returned he didn't know he had. Laughter in crystalline halls. Debates that lasted centuries. A single word spoken by a voice he could no longer name, promising they'd meet again. He hadn't failed. He had survived. And now, through the hands of beings who should have never even been on the galactic map, he had remembered. The humans retrieved what they could. They didn't ask for anything in return, and Cathal gave them everything. He created a map, not of places, but of voices once lost, beacons buried in silence, knowledge scattered in entropy. Not coordinates, not treasure, just the chance to listen back. He placed it in their care, and they carried it without pride, only purpose. Earth became more than a blue marble. It became the beginning. Other species noticed. Quiet civilizations long dormant sent out cautious probes, not in fear of invasion, but out of curiosity, because something had changed. A silence that had reigned for eons now rang with echoes. It was humanity who taught the void how to speak again. Cathal withdrew from constant observation, not because he was abandoning them, but because he no longer needed to watch every step. They were no longer children. They were beacons. He listened instead, to music played on spacefaring instruments made from asteroids, to lectures where human children debated the ethics of waking ancient AI minds. to laughter shared between species who had nothing in common but the desire to not be alone. He felt something he hadn't allowed himself since the last Thennery signal faded. Not just curiosity, but peace. And in that peace, he composed his own final message, not to Earth, not to the stars, but to whatever might come next. I waited 17 million years for someone to speak. What I found were those who dared to sing. You will know them by their noise, their wonder, and the way they reach not with conquest, but with questions. If you hear this, they are near. And if you become as I did, do not fear them. They are humanity. The message repeated, endlessly, not because he expected it to be found, but because he believed it might be.